It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? It's a neighborly day in this beauty wood, a neighborly day for beauty. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? I have always wanted to have a neighbor just like you. I've always wanted to live in a neighborhood with you. So let's make the most of this beautiful day. Since we're together, we might as well say, would you be mine? Could you be mine? Won't you be my neighbor? Won't you please? Won't you please? Please won't you be my neighbor? My neighbor? I'm glad we're together.
Hello, good beans, and welcome back to Midnight Requiem. Today we'll be talking about Fred McFeely Rogers, better known as Mr. Rogers, was an American television host, author, producer, and Presbyterian minister. He was the creator, showrunner, and host of the preschool television series Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, which ran from 1968 to 2001. Born in Pennsylvania, Rogers earned a bachelor's degree in music from Rollins College in 1951. He began his television career at NBC in New York City, returning to Pittsburgh in 1953 to work for children's programming at NET, later PBS television station WQED. He graduated from Pittsburgh Theological Seminary with a bachelor's degree in divinity in 1962. And became a Presbyterian minister in 1963. He attended the University of Pittsburgh Graduate School of Child Development, where he began his 30-year collaboration with child psychologist Margaret McFarland. He also helped develop the children's show The Children's Corner, 1955, for WQED in Pittsburgh, and Mr. Rogers, 1963, in Canada for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. In 1968, he returned to Pittsburgh and adapted the format of his Canadian series to create Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. It ran for 33 years and was critically acclaimed for focusing on children's emotional and physical concerns, such as death, sibling rivalry, school enrollment, and divorce. Mr. Rogers, born in 1928 at 705 Main Street in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, his father, James Hillis Rogers, was a very successful businessman who was president of the McFeely Brick Company, one of Latrobe's most prominent businesses. His mother, Nancy McFeely, knitted sweaters for American soldiers from Western Pennsylvania who were fighting in Europe and regularly volunteered at the Latrobe Hospital. Initially dreaming of becoming a doctor, she settled for a life of hospital volunteer work. Her father, Fred Brooks McFeely, after whom Rogers was named, was an entrepreneur. Rogers grew up in a large 3-story brick house at 737 Weldon Street in Latrobe. He had a sister, Elaine, whom the Rogerses adopted when he was 11 years old. Rogers spent much of his childhood alone playing with puppets and also spent time with his grandfather. He began playing the piano when he was 5 through an ancestor who immigrated from Germany to the U.S., Johannes Merferet, born in 1732. Rogers is the 6th cousin of the actor Tom Hanks, who portrays him in the film A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood 2019. Rogers had a difficult childhood, shy, introverted, and overweight. He was frequently homebound after suffering bouts of asthma. He was bullied as a child for his weight and called Fat Freddy. According to Morgan Neville, director of the 2018 documentary Won't You Be My Neighbor, Rogers had a lonely childhood. I think he made friends with himself as much as he could. He had ventriloquist dummy, he had stuffed animals, and he would create his own world in his childhood bedroom. Rogers attended Latrobe High School, where he overcame his shyness. It was tough for me at the beginning, Rogers told NPR's Terry Gross in 1984, and then I made a couple friends who found out that the core of me was okay, and one of them was the head of the football team. Rogers became president of the Student Council, a member of the National Honor Society, and editor-in-chief of the school yearbook. He registered for the draft in Greensburg, Pennsylvania in 1948 at age 20, where he was classified 1A. However, his status was changed to unqualified for military service following an armed force physical on October 12, 1950. He attended Dartmouth College for 1 year before transferring to Rollins College, where he graduated magna cum laude in 1951 with a Bachelor of Music. He then attended Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, from which he graduated magna cum laude in 1962 with a Bachelor of Divinity, and was ordained a Presbyterian minister by the Pittsburgh Presbytery of the United Presbyterian Church in 1963. His work as an ordained minister, rather than to pastor a church, was to minister to children and their families through television. He regularly appeared before church officials to maintain his ordination. Rogers wanted to enter seminary after college, but instead chose to go into a nascent medium of television after experiencing TV at his parents' home in 1951. During his senior year at Rollins College, in a CNN interview, he said, "I went into television because I hated it so, and I thought there's some way of using this fabulous instrument to nurture those who would watch and listen." After graduating in 1951, he worked at NBC in New York City as floor director of Your Hit Parade, The Kate Smith Hour, and Gabby Hayes' children's show, as an assistant producer of The Voice of Firestone. In 1953, Rogers returned to Pittsburgh to work as a program developer at public television station WQED. Josie Curry worked with him to develop the children's show The Children's Corner, which Curry hosted. Rogers worked off-camera to develop puppets, characters, and music for the show. He used many puppet characters developed during this time, such as Daniel the Striped Tiger, named after WQED station manager Dorothy Daniel, who gave Rogers Tiger puppet before the show's premiere. X the Owl, Henrietta, and Lady Elaine. In his later work, children's television entertainer Ernie Combs was an assistant puppeteer. The Children's Corner won a Sylvania Award for Best Locally Produced Children's Programming in 1955 and was broadcast nationally on NBC. In 1963, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, CBC, in Toronto contracted Rogers to come to Toronto, develop and host the 15-minute black and white children's program, Mr. Rogers. It lasted for 1963 to 1967. It was the first time Rogers appeared on camera. CBC's children's programming head, Fred Rainsbury, insisted on it, telling Rogers, "Fred, I've seen you talk with kids. Let's put you yourself on the air." Combs joined Rogers in Toronto as an assistant puppeteer. Rogers also worked with Combs on the children's show Butternut Square from 1964 to 1967. Rogers acquired the rights to Mr. Rogers in 1967 and returned to Pittsburgh with his wife, 2 young sons, and the sets he developed. Despite a potentially promising career with CBC and no job prospects in Pittsburgh, on Rogers' recommendation, Combs remained in Toronto and became Rogers' Canadian equivalent of an iconic television personality, creating the children's program Mr. Dress-Up, which ran from 1967 to 1996. Rogers' works for CBC helped shape and develop the concept and style of his later program for the Public Broadcasting Service, PBC, in the United States. Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, a half-hour educational children's program starring Rogers, began airing nationally in 1968 and ran for 895 episodes. It was videotaped at WQED in Pittsburgh and broadcast by National Educational Television, NET, which later became the Public Broadcasting Service. Its first season had 180 black and white episodes. Each subsequent season filmed in color and funded by PBS, the Sears Roebuck Foundation, and other charities consisted of 65 episodes. By the time it ended production in December 2000, its average rating was about 0.7% of television households, or 680,000 homes, and it aired on 384 PBS stations at its peak in 1985 through 1986. Its ratings were 2.1% or 1.8 million homes. The last original episode aired in 2001, but PBS continued to air reruns, and by 2016 it was the third longest running program in PBS history. Many of the sets and props in Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, like the trolley, the sneakers, and the castle, were created for Rogers' show in Toronto, but CBS designers and producers of the program also incorporated most of the highly imaginative elements that later became famous, such as its slow pace and its host's quiet manner. The format of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood remained virtually unchanged for the entire run of the program. Every episode began with a camera eye view of a model of a neighborhood, then panning in closer to a representation of a house, while a piano instrumental of the theme song Won't You Be My Neighbor, performed by music director Johnny Costa, and inspired by Beethoven's sonata, is played. Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood emphasized young children's social and emotional needs, and unlike another PBS show, Sesame Street, which premiered in 1969, did not focus on cognitive learning. Writer Kathy Murlock Jackson said, "While both shows target the same preschool audience and prepare children for kindergarten, Sesame Street concentrates on school readiness skills, while Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood focused on the child's developing psyche and feelings and sense of moral and ethical reasoning. The neighborhood also spent fewer resources on research than Sesame Street, but Rogers used early childhood education concepts taught by his mentor, Margaret McFarland, Benjamin Spock, Eric Erickson, and T. Barry Brazelton in his lessons. As the Washington Post noted, Rogers taught young children about civility, tolerance, sharing, and self-worth in a reassuring tone and leisurely cadence. He tackled difficult topics such as the death of a family pet, sibling rivalry, the addition of newborn into a family, moving and enrolling in a new school, and divorce. For example, he wrote a special segment that dealt with the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy that aired on June 7, 1968, 2 days after the assassination occurred. According to King, the process of putting each episode of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood together was painstaking, and Rogers' contribution to the program was astounding. Rogers wrote and edited all the episodes, played the piano, and sang for most of the songs, wrote 200 songs and 13 operas, created all the characters, both puppet and human, played most of the significant puppet roles, hosted every episode, and approved every detail of the program. The puppets created for the neighborhood of make-believe included an extraordinary variety of personalities. They were simple puppets, but complex, complicated, and utterly honest beings. In 1971, Rogers formed Family Communications, Inc. to produce the neighborhood, other programs, and non-broadcast materials. In 1975, Rogers stopped producing Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood to focus on adult programming. Reruns of the neighborhood continued to air on PBS. King reports that the decision caught many of his coworkers and supporters off guard. Rogers continued to confer with McFarland about child development and early childhood education. However, in 1979, after an almost 5-year hiatus, Rogers returned to producing the neighborhood. King calls the new season version stronger and more sophisticated than ever. King writes that the program's second run in the 1980s and it was such a cultural touchstone that it had inspired numerous parodies, most notably Eddie Murphy's parody on Saturday Night Live in the early 1980s. Rogers retired from producing The Neighborhood in 2001 at age 73. Although reruns continued to air, he and FCI had been making about 2 or 3 weeks of new programs per year for many years, filling the rest of his time slots from a library of about 300 shows made since 1979. The final original episode of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood aired on August 31st, 2001. In 1969, Rogers testified before the U.S. Senate Subcommittee on Communications, which was chaired by Democratic Senator John Pastor of Rhode Island. U.S. President Lyndon Johnson had proposed a $20 million bill for the creation of PBS before he left office, but his successor Richard Nixon wanted to cut the funding to $10 million. Even though Rogers was not yet nationally known, he was chosen to testify because of his ability to make persuasive arguments and to connect emotionally with his audience. The clip of Rogers' testimony, which was televised and has been viewed by millions of people on the internet, helped to secure fundings for PBS for many years afterward. According to King, Rogers' testimony was considered one of the most powerful pieces of a testimony ever offered before Congress, and one of the most powerful pieces of video presentation ever. It brought Pastor to tears, and also, according to King, has been studied by public relations experts and academics. Congressional funding for PBS increased from $9 million to $22 million. In 1970, Nixon appointed Rogers as chair of the White House Conference on Children and Youth. In 1987, Rogers visited Moscow to appear as the first guest on the long-running Soviet children's TV show Good Night, Little Ones. The appearance was broadcast in the Soviet Union on December 7th, coinciding with the Washington Summit meeting between Soviet leader and U.S. President in Washington, D.C. Rogers gave scores of interviews. Though reluctant to appear on television talk shows, he would usually charm the host with his quick wit and ability to ad-lib on a moment's notice. Rogers was one of the country's most sought-after commencement speakers, making over 150 speeches. His friend and colleague David Noel reported that Rogers would agonize over a speech, and King reported that Rogers was at his least guarded during his speeches, which were about children, television, education, his view of the world, how to make the world a better place, and his quest for self-knowledge. His tone was quiet and informal, but commanded attention. In many speeches, including the ones he made accepting a Lifetime Achievement Emmy in 1997 for his induction into the Television Hall of Fame in 1999, and his final commencement speech at Dartmouth College in 2002, he instructed his audience to remain silent and think for a moment about someone who had a good influence on them. On March 1st, 2003, a private funeral was held for Rogers in Unity Chapel, which was restored by Rogers' father at Unity Cemetery in Latrobe. About 80 relatives, co-workers, and close friends attended the service, which was planned in a great secrecy so that those closest to him could grieve in private. Reverend John McCall, pastor of the Rogers Family Church, 6 Pepperstein Church in Squirrel Hill, gave the homily. Reverend William Barker, a retired Pepperstein minister who was a close friend of Mr. Rogers and the voice of Mr. Platypus on his show, read Rogers' favorite Bible passage. Rogers was interred at Unity Cemetery in his hometown Latrobe, Pennsylvania, in a mausoleum owned by his mother's family. On May 3rd, 2003, a public memorial was held at Heinz Hall in Pittsburgh. According to the Most Gazette, 2,700 people attended. Violinist Itzhak Perlman, cellist Yo-Yo Ma, and organist Alan Morrison performed in honor of Rogers. Barker officiated that service. Also in attendance were Pittsburgh philanthropist Elsie Hillman, former Good Morning America host David Hartman, the very hungry caterpillar Arthur Eric Carle, and Arthur creator Mark Brown, businesswoman and philanthropist Teresa Hines, PBS president Pat Mitchell, and executive director of the Pittsburgh Project Selim Gerbel gave remarks. Jeff Erlanger, who at age 10 appeared on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood in 1981 to explain his electric wheelchair, also spoke. The memorial was broadcast several times on Pittsburgh television stations and websites throughout the day.
I hope you're able to grow to respect whoever you are inside. It's such a good feeling to know you're alive. It's such a happy feeling. You're growing inside, and when you wake up ready to say, I think I'll make a snappy new day. It's such a good feeling, a very good feeling. The feeling you know that I'll be back when the day is new, and I'll have more ideas for you, and you'll have things you'll want to talk about.
Leave a white heart in the comments in remembrance of them. And as always, be loving and caring, my good beings.